Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to begin our webinar shortly. We're going to go ahead and do a quick sound check for all of you that are listening via broadcast. We have a little guy at the bottom of the screen right underneath the file share. If you could go ahead and click on it, we're going to play Simon Says, and you're going to raise your hands. So Simon Says, raise your hands if you can hear us properly. Very good. And we're going to go ahead and put our hands back down just to make sure that these are accurate functions you're using. Thank you so much for joining us. I see a lot of people are still trickling in. I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Juana Amaria, and I am the Business Services Coordinator with Illinois WorkNet. And we are so fortunate to have Greg Newton on here with us today and, of course, on Monday as well. And I'm going to go ahead and just switch the screen. And go ahead and just keep introducing yourselves. We would love to know who's on, and a lot of you obviously know each other, so you can go ahead and chit-chat and say hello. Underneath the chat pod, you'll notice that we have a file share, and some of you were on very early, so the early birds got to download and print their PowerPoint and documents included in this meeting. What I also wanted to do is for those of you that are in via the conference call number, go ahead and mute your speakers because you don't want to have that playback. It'll get very confusing for you. Now, what I also wanted to mention, let me go ahead and switch the screen. This is who we are. We didn't put the cameras up because they get quite distracting, but this is how you can get in contact with us. And if you have technical difficulties, go ahead and email us at the info@illinoisworknet.com. I'm going to switch this over. For our agenda, you'll get a chance to kind of go through. What I wanted to let you know is that we are tweeting about this webinar live. So if you want to join our conversation, go ahead and enter pound WRKNet OJT, and so you'll be able to follow the conversation. That's for all those that weren't able to make it to the webinar. We are at full capacity. I also wanted to let you know that we do have a Q&A session for this webinar, but you will not be able to ask your questions via the phone lines just because it is so busy. We will have DCO staff on here that will be able to answer questions specific to the Illinois policy on OJT. And so we're going to go ahead and let you know when that option is available. But for everyone else, go ahead and enter them in the Q&A chat pod. We've already gone through the housekeeping items, and although he doesn't need any introductions, I'm sure, I would like to welcome Greg Newton on WorkNet and on our OJT webinar. He's got a lot of very, very relevant information for you all. We've worked very hard to put this together, to make it pretty, to make it engaging, and so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and let Greg take over. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Greg Newton. I've had the opportunity to work with some of you before, and I'm certainly looking forward to working with all of you this afternoon. Certainly the concept of on-the-job training has been around for many years, but its increased emphasis makes it tremendously important. What I'm hoping to do today is to have us focus on the connection between job-seeking candidates for OJT and OJT opportunity. This is really not a policy seminar. We're fortunate to have people from the department there that are policy experts, and they'll be available to you as we begin to bring my presentation to a close and have a conversation. But today is really about how do we design it? How do we actually make it work? And as I understand it, in Illinois, as across the country, many people are not just beginning to implement the AARA NEG OJT, but also beginning to use more and more alternative funding such as WIA form funds, TANF funds, and other funds for OJT. So while our focus today will be on WIA OJT and the NEG OJT, many of the design principles are the same. So what I hope you'll do is you'll take something from the thoughts I have to share, but most of all, I'm hoping that we'll have a good dialogue at the end so that we can make it real for you. So let's dig right in, and I guess the first thing I want to do is the obvious one. Our whole business is about connecting supply and demand. The supply in the labor market are the people who have talent, and the demand is the employers who need them. What we must do is to somehow focus on that line right in the middle. It's the line of connection. One of the things that makes OJT an important product, but sometimes a challenging product, is it is a dual customer product. It is one of the few things we do that has a direct connection between employers and job seekers. One of the reasons why the United States Department of Labor and others are moving toward OJT is that it is a direct connection. Under traditional training models of where we train, we then have to pray that people will get a job. But under OJT, people have both a job and have training. So this is the connection that we're attempting to achieve today. We can decide to work either outward from talent to jobs or work outward from jobs to talent. And that will be a lot of our analysis about how do we design our program. No matter how you do it, there are three significant processes we will be reviewing. One is how do we actually bring these two markets together. The other one is the processes that are directly related to the job seeker. And then there's the processes that are directly related to the employer. Many of the employer processes we will be covering on Monday for those of you who decide to join us. So what we're going to begin to do is to think about these three critical processes and about how we connect talent to jobs and how we connect jobs to talent. And there are basically four ways to make this connection work. And if you'll follow along with me, you will notice that I've labeled them as A, B, C, and D. Strategy A is a job development strategy. It is where we take the candidate and we actively promote that candidate to the employer for an OJT opportunity. That's working outward from the job seeker. We can choose to work outward from the employer and promote OJT, and then to attempt to find the appropriate candidate for that OJT opportunity. And then there's strategy C, which is where we teach job seekers themselves to market OJT to employers. And then there's strategy D, where employers in their recruitment process begins to identify potential candidates for the OJT program. There are pluses and minuses to each of these four strategies. What I'm hoping that you will take from this portion of the discussion is to identify which strategy or strategies, because it may take more than one, that is most appropriate for the operation of your program. So we're going to be looking at all four of these. Strategy A, which is promote candidates in job development. Strategy B, which is to promote OJT and to refer candidates. Strategy C, which is teaching job seekers how to promote OJT eligibility. And then finally, strategy D, where employers identify potential candidates for us. So let's go through each one of these and look at the pluses and minuses that might exist in each of them, and then begin to put together a strategic way to approach our program design within OJT. Strategy A has one great advantage, that we are not getting OJT openings that we cannot fill. The big plus here is you know who you have. And ultimately, employers always want to know the who. And by the way, any employer who doesn't want to know the who would be a problem for me, because it means they're only buying the subsidy and they're not buying the candidate. Employers eventually will always want to know who. No matter which of these strategies that you in fact adopt, we must recognize that employers are hiring someone here, And regardless of the amount of subsidy, they're going to want someone who will be able to learn the job. One of the ways to implement Strategy A is to tie it to job referral. When we begin to refer individuals to employers and employers say, boy, I really like them, but they just didn't have all the skills that they needed, well, that's a perfect opening for OJT. One of the pluses with starting with people who are already enrolled in your adult program or dislocated worker program is this is one of the strategies that can be used to achieve your entered employment. One of the things that is happening around the country that may or may not be appropriate for you is that people are seeing OJT as a potential tag-on after classroom training. Unfortunately, in many cases, people who have gone to school are very, very well credentialed, but they do not have the work experience to permit them to compete in a very tough labor market. So North Carolina, for example, has as its priority to ensure those that we have already made an investment in are connected to the labor market through OJT. Just because you have received occupational classroom training, it does not necessarily mean that you have all of the skills for that specific job that that particular employer is offering. So Strategy A, for me, has many, many pluses because it starts with who you have on the shelf, and it does not require us necessarily to search and to recruit. So if you have a large number of enrolled individuals in your program, if you're having a challenge in meeting your entered employment rate for those individuals that are in the program, this particular strategy may be very, very good for you. Strategy B is when we work outward from the employer and we identify potential OJT openings that we can fill. What I believe is probably the biggest risk here is that we will identify OJT openings that we're not able to fill. This is really one of the great risks in terms of this particular strategy. And to make this strategy work, one of the first things we will always need to do is to see who is available or who may be potentially available, and then from that, identify which employers to target, because we would want to target based upon who we have. Once, in fact, we've received such an opening, it is exceptionally important that whoever is controlling the referral process ensure high quality. Now, we'll talk about this later, but this is probably one of the most important concepts of OJT, is that OJT is for individuals who are not qualified for the job. OJT is for people that employers would not otherwise have been hired by an employer. So quality control here does not necessarily mean and should not mean that every person will meet every qualification in the job, because if they meet every qualification, then no OJT is needed. But quality control here does mean that the individual has basic good workplace behaviors, they have the ability to learn, they have the foundation skills from which they can learn the skill, because what we're promising employers in this process is not that they will be referred fully qualified individuals, but that we are referring individuals that have the potential to be great employees. One of the things we'll spend some time on Monday is that people who use this particular process will need to become talented at promoting candidates that do not have all the skills. It's a much easier job to promote someone who has everything that's needed for a job plus more. But how do you promote a candidate in this kind of competitive labor market that in fact has the ability to be a good employee when there are so many individuals applying that already are fully qualified? And that's a discussion for Monday. So working outward from the employer market, identifying OJT opportunities and seeking candidates is strategy B. Strategy C is one that has been used across the country, particularly in rural areas and particularly in areas where there is not dedicated employer staffing or not a dedicated business services team. And it simply says that job seekers, as they are seeking a job, should in fact have a tool with them that will permit them to communicate to employers their potential eligibility for OJT. And then employers, if interested, contact the OJT organization to determine whether or not an OJT contract can be arranged. If you are going to use this approach, it will be exceptionally important that you give the job seeker tangible tools that accurately describe OJT so that there is no misunderstanding. And moreover, we have to make clear to the employer that this is not a program for people who they would have hired otherwise. It's important that we teach job seekers how to use these tools and how to do so within the job search workshop itself. And so we're going to want to make sure that the tools we use, if the candidate is promoting him or herself as an eligible OJT candidate to employers, is appropriate. The United States Department of Labor, on its website of the United States Department of Labor's OJT Toolkit, included a sample letter that might in fact be used for this purpose. While it may not be entirely the letter that I would have used, it includes many of the good characteristics of such a letter because it clearly identifies what the program is really about. So strategy C is simply about using your current job seekers during their job search to promote their OJT eligibility. And then finally, we have strategy D. Now, strategy D is really employer referral. And I'm going to spend a moment on this because I do think this strategy has viability, but it is also the strategy that if it is not done right, is the strategy that can get us most in trouble. Employers in their own recruitment process may identify individuals who are eligible for the OJT program that they would like to hire and train. This particular approach says that we as OJT organizations approach employers, we teach them about OJT, we make clear what OJT is, and we say, hey, if you find somebody in your recruitment process that you believe may be eligible for this program, then we would like to meet them. We'd like to work with you to see if we can arrange a contract for that particular purpose. So here's the great risk. First of all, we must make sure that employers recognize that this is not for individuals they would have hired otherwise. They are actually the candidates that would have otherwise not even been in the running. One of the things that got us in trouble a number of years ago is that the United States Department of Labor found that in many cases this was being treated as a hiring subsidy and not a training subsidy. The Work Opportunity Tax Credit is a hiring subsidy, but OJT is a training subsidy that is available to employers who hire candidates. They must not start before the contract is in place. Employers must understand that not everyone is eligible, and probably most important from a technical compliance perspective is that any individual who is placed in OJT in this particular strategy must meet all of the qualifications to be eligible for OJT program eligibility. So that strategy D works outward from the employer, and the employer actually becomes a recruiter in the process. So really what the big discussion, at least for me, is here, is which of these strategies or some combination of these strategies will you use in your program design? Well, I think there's a whole bunch of considerations as you're beginning to make a decision as to which of these strategies you want to emphasize. Let's just go through some of them very quickly to hone your decision making. First of all, we have to understand, not understand, but decide, particularly in the case of the NEG OJT, is our goal here to simply have a successful NEG program, or are we shifting to OJT as a major form of training delivery? One of the things that I noted in the Illinois plan to United States Department of Labor is that Illinois believes that we should be using this money to build a sustainable OJT strategy. And this isn't necessarily a personal opinion, but I do believe that it is one of the things that's happening around the country. People are beginning to believe that just sending people to school is not enough to attach people in a labor market like this. That one of the challenges is that much of the training is all classroom-based without a work-based component. And without a work-based component, sometimes people can learn but not be employed. If you believe that OJT is the way you want to do business in the future, not just with these special funds, but with all of your funds, then you will probably need to staff it. And to make it work, you will probably need to do a lot of strategy A and B, which is a direct connection strategy as opposed to employer referral and self-marketing strategies. So you have to choose the strategy to begin to be good at it based upon to what degree you believe that this is the way you want to do business in the future. The more OJTs that you need to in fact complete to meet the intended number under your contract will also have an influence on your strategy, because the more OJTs that you need, probably the more strategies you will need. I am a big fan of strategy A, which works outward from the job seekers we have. But if you have a limited number of individuals enrolled into your adult program, or if you are having a limited number of individuals enrolled in your dislocated worker program, then you may not have a sufficient pool of candidates from which to market outward from that pool. So consequently, you may have to move to a different strategy, including employer referral. I do think that this fourth bullet is very important. My own personal belief is that once someone comes into our program and we've provided them any services, that our services are not finished until we have helped them enter a job. When you do reverse referrals, you may in fact help individuals get a job, but what is our obligation to those individuals whom we are already serving? One of the things that's interesting from the United States Department of Labor's perspective, and I think it's rooted in the law, that OJT is actually a job seeker service. It's not a business service. It's a job seeker service that requires business engagement. If in fact it is a job seeker service, then that would lead us to strategies A, B, and C with less focus on reverse referral. If you are an area that has done OJT in the past and you have a long history of OJT, sometimes it's difficult to shift strategies midstream. If you have always used strategy D with reverse referral, it may be very difficult to wean existing employers from that particular perspective. But it does not mean that we would have to do that with all new customers in the future. So that's just some things to think about. I'm just going to give you what I think, but it doesn't mean it's important because it's really what you think. You've already heard my bias. I think we have an obligation to our current customers. So I'm a big fan of strategy A because it says we need to invest where we've already made investments. I do think that whether through job development or referral, those should be our first choices. So I would start with strategies A and B. If I'm having a difficult time in achieving the quantity of OJTs that I need, I would then begin to shift to strategy C and D. I do think strategy C is a viable strategy in cases where you have very limited staff. I would not choose to make strategy D as my first choice, but I would in fact include it in my arsenal, because if we in fact are not able to expend these dollars, they are at risk of rescission. So anyway, that's just my particular thought. You get to make your own choice, but what's probably important is that you make a choice. So the first issue is, how will you connect? Which of the 4 strategies will you give emphasis? Regardless of which strategy you in fact adopt, or even if you adopt all 4 of them, you will now need to focus on 3 key OJT processes. The processes that relate to the job seeker, the processes that relate to employers, and the processes that relate to connection. I do think one of the things that's important to note here is that the staffing of OJT is a great challenge. One of the reasons why OJT has not been used more frequently in the recent past is because it's a complicated program. That's just the simple truth. I think it's probably a valuable program, at least I know it is for me, but it is very complicated. An ITA is much, much easier than an OJT. Staffing in our organizations tend to be heavy on the job seeker side. The job seeker side can process ITAs in isolation of any kind of involvement with employers at all. But once you begin to do OJT, since it is a direct connection product, it means that there sometimes has to be 2 sets of staff involved. Staff that work with employers and staff that work with job seekers. One of the things that is a high risk around the country is that people are implementing OJT without being clear as to what is the role of the employer staff and what is the role of the job seeker staff. The middle column is the most critical column. You can't just do the 2 outside columns, but someone has to do the middle column. And the middle column really requires communication, clarity, and coordination between the employer and the job seeker staff to ensure not only that we comply, but that we have good connection. So one of the first questions to ask yourself is, how will job-seeking staff and employer staff interact in terms of connection? If you have not done so, one of the first things I would recommend you need to do, and it doesn't have to be really complicated and long, but we need very clear procedures about how this connection will happen. And if we are implementing strategy A, which works outward from the job seeker, then that is one set of procedures. But if in fact we have business service staff contacting employers to identify OJT opportunities, then that's a different procedure. So let's say, for example, the employer OJT, the employer staff contact an employer with an OJT opportunity. Who will select the candidates? Who will vet the candidates? Who will assess the candidates? Who will do the skill gap analysis? Who will update the IEP? All of those are very kinds of questions. And I just want to say one thing that I think is probably pretty important here that has to be outlined in terms of the procedures is that one of the greatest risk areas of compliance here is that there will be something in the training plan and the contract that is not in the IEP with the participant. So consequently, we have to figure out how is this joint data entry, how do we ensure mirroring of files on both the employer side and the job seeker side is accomplished, and we have to figure out who does what to be able to achieve the connection. So let's take a real quick look at actually some of the process elements. We're not going to have time to do each of these, but let's start some with the job seeker processes. First of all, one of the key issues is OJT eligibility. And I just want to point out, you can be program eligible, but not be OJT eligible. You must, in the case of ARRA NEG OJT, be a dislocated worker with prolonged unemployment of at least 22 weeks, I think in Illinois is what I read, and you must have been unemployed since January of 2008. So you can be a dislocated worker but not necessarily be eligible for OJT. The second thing that is true is in the case of the adult program, if you are using formula money, just because they are an eligible WIA adult, they must be made eligible for training the same way they would be made eligible for training if they were going to use an ITA. One of the things that sometimes people need to think about if they're going to use employer reverse referral is that this individual who is sent by the employer must in fact be found to need training the same way as if they were going to use an ITA. The service plan is exceptionally important here. The service plan, the individual employment plan, is absolutely key here. And just one recommendation is that the training plan should be made a part of the IEP, because whenever possible, we want to ensure that our contract documents mirror our participant documents. So just a couple more things on this. This issue of documenting and determining eligibility is significant here, and the most important thing to remember here is they must be program eligible and they must be OJT eligible. And if you are running the NEG OJT, you must in fact meet those requirements as well. They must first be a dislocated worker, they must be prolonged unemployed of at least 22 weeks, and they must have been unemployed since January of 2008. So consequently, what the real issue begins to be, after in fact determined was that, I just saw a note here, if I was not clear, let me be clear here. What Mike is saying is I thought that they had to be unemployed as of January 2008 in order to be eligible. And I guess that when we get to the policy portion of the seminar, then people can clarify that if I was incorrect. Regardless, even once eligibility has been determined, we do have to determine who is the best bet OJT candidates. This is a tough call because the first two are really worth talking about. OJT is for those individuals who are almost there, but not too close to being there. We want individuals that do not have a huge gap from the skills that are required, because if the gap is huge, then it's probably not an OJT activity. Moreover, particularly with the ARRA NEG OJT, it can be no longer than 6 months. So they can't have too large of a gap. But if the gap of skills is too small, then people can begin to question, do they need OJT or would they have otherwise been hired? So there's sort of a strategic choice here of not too far away from the skills that are needed, but not too close to the skills that are needed either. OJT is perfect for career changers because education alone will not always get you a new career. It may be in the case of a nurse, but in non-credential positions where there's not the same kind of high demand, sometimes people need this very specific work-based learning opportunity, and it usually does well in relationship to those individuals who are needing to get their foot into the door. OJT is really not for individuals who do not have basic skills, and we must remember it is really for work-ready candidates. This isn't a work experience program, it's an occupational training program. Work experience is a great thing. People may, in fact, need work experience and then need OJT, but we need to make sure we're sending work-ready, even if not fully qualified in terms of skills for the job. Veterans always have priority for all of our services, and that's true here in terms of OJT as well. One of the challenges with reverse referrals from employers is how do we ensure veteran priority is achieved. I've included some of the other ways you might want to identify who you would give priority to. The United States Department of Labor states that we should give lots of focus to those with the greatest challenges and the most in need. But you've heard my bias about training graduates. One of the things that Illinois said in its state plan is that it intends to work with IDES to ensure that we're giving focus to claimants who have either exhausted or nearing exhausting their unemployment insurance. So in your procedures guide, whether it is job seeker staff or employer staff who will be doing the selection, you need some kind of criteria by which that choice will be made. As we mentioned, on Monday, we'll be focusing predominantly on the issue of working with employers and outreaching with employers. So I'm going to spend less time on this particular one now and to move forward to talk some about the OJT connection. The most important point on this page is that the training plan is key to success in the OJT program. The training plan is the heart of what OJT is. And moreover, the training plan must be developed in such a way and such a sequence to ensure that we are giving a true meaningful training opportunity for the candidate. Just a real quick side note is somewhere times around the country when I've been doing OJT training, one of the most frequent questions people ask is Greg, can you give us a training plan that we can use? Well, I wish I could, but I can't give you a training plan you can use. And the simple truth is I can't do that because every training plan is unique. And the reason that every training plan is unique is because every OJT candidate is unique in terms of their experience and skills, and every job is unique. If you, in fact, work with a company where there is multiple OJTs, it will not be possible for all the training plans to look alike, because even if the job is alike, each of the individuals are different. And as we'll talk about, under USDOL policy, one of the things that must be considered in terms of training plan development is the prior experience and the skill levels of individuals. So we'll look in a moment at this whole concept of the sequence by which we determine an OJT training plan, but we must recognize that OJT plans are unique to the individual and unique to the job. So consequently, let's begin to talk some about the training plan and about OJT. I've just included directly out of the law what the Workforce Investment Act says OJT is. The one thing I do want to note here, though, is the second bullet under the first paragraph, which says reimbursement to the employer up to 50% of the wage rate. That's true under Formula WIA, unless the state has received a waiver. However, in the case of the ARRA NEG OJT, we can vary the reimbursement by size of the employer. But what WIA OJT is, and each of these words are important, is training by an employer. That's the reason why we have to have a training plan. It's to a paid participants, and that means that in fact they are employed in a job, and that the training duration must take into account the experience and the skill levels of the individual. So the training plan is the heart of OJT, because what the training plan is how will you fill the gap? How will you fill the gap between the skills the individual has with the skills that is required by the job? A structured occupational training opportunity, and I think that Illinois did a great job of this in terms of its policy, and for those of you who are under the NEG OJT, is that it must be a structured training opportunity. One of the things that I know that United States Department of Labor is concerned about is to what degree the training plan identifies who will do the training. We must know what it is that people will need to learn, how they will be taught it, what is the expected time period under which they will learn it, and then some evaluation to know if they learned it. So consequently, it must not just be buying training, but the training must be planned in the training plan. The duration of the training can be no longer than what is needed for the individual to become proficient in that occupation. So this would be my suggestion to you on this particular slide. I believe this is the sequence by which a training plan must be developed. We need to start out with the job duties. Now, the job duties and the job skills may or may not be always the same thing, but are definitely connected. It is not my opinion that a job description is a sufficient document, unless it's a pretty complicated one, of the skills it takes to do the job. A job description says what you will do. The skills are what you must know to be able to do it. That means that in most cases, and I think what is required is very important here, is that Illinois requires is that all training plans will have an ONET code. And for those of you who use ONET frequently, then you need to continue to use it. For those of you not familiar with ONET, this is a very important tool here. With smaller businesses who do not have job descriptions, in many cases you will have to identify the duties and the skills, but in order to do the training plan, we first start with the job. Then we must assess the OJT candidate skills. We'll talk in a minute about how to do that, but the goal is to identify what is the gap between what is required and what the job seeker and OJT candidate has. That permits you to do a training plan with the duration, and you could not do a contract without having the training plan in place, because the contract talks about reimbursement based upon number of hours, number of weeks, and all of that duration has to be embedded in the training plan. And then, of course, after the contract's in place, we have to make sure that people actually learned the skill itself. So there's important issues here in terms of this particular training plan. The one thing worth noting on this is the United States Department of Labor was asked in its questions and answers if we could use educational attainment as a proxy for skills, and they said absolutely not. Moreover, we can't just use work history as a proxy for skills. That you can have worked a long time in a particular industry, and that may be an indicator of skills, but it is not a sufficient definition of skills. So one of the things that needs to be done here is that we have to, in fact, look at specific skills needed for this specific kind of job. There's many different ways to do this. I think some of you in Illinois use work keys. Certainly individuals who are at the bronze level or at the silver level are good candidates for OJT. I would suggest to you if they're at the gold level, then that means that they're a perfect skill fit. And so therefore OJT would not be so great. But one of the things that they do in Portland, Oregon that I like a lot that's referenced in the Illinois policy is the first choice in assessment tools in terms of determining the gap is if the employer has such a tool they use to assess new hires, then that should always be the tool that is used. Whenever possible, we want to use the assessment tools that employers have in place. If that is not in place, then ONET will need to be a proxy. And one of the things that ONET permits us to do is it permits us to get a look at the skills and to begin to make a determination at what level of skill people are at. So this is directly from the United States Department of Labor. I don't know how many of you use Prove It, but Prove It is another wonderful assessment tool that is occupational specific and has embedded in it an analysis of what the individual skill gap is. For those of you who are not familiar with My Skills, My Future, which is a part now of ONET by the United States Department of Labor, you need to use that tool. And again, that's recognized in the Illinois State Plan because what it permits you to do is to look at transferable skill gaps. So looking at the duration is another way we can use ONET. And there's something called the SVPR, which leads to the specific vocational preparation ranges. And in general, the following is true. Even though there are 7 levels, OJT is probably not appropriate for level 1 and level 2. And level 6 and level 7 are of such long preparation period, it is probably a classroom training activity. So one of the things you'll need to justify is the training duration based upon what is typically taken for someone to learn that occupation. Now real quickly, because we don't have a great deal of time, you should recognize that even within these ranges, where in these ranges does a specific individual fit? Well, they could be at the upper end of the range if they have specific barriers to employment. If they have a specific disability that would require increased accommodation, then they're probably at the upper end. If they, in fact, are an individual who's never worked in that industry or in a related occupation within that family, they're probably at the upper end of the range. But in cases where people have worked in that occupation, but this job is unique, or they have worked in that industry, then they probably are going to somehow fit at the lower end of the spectrum. So the training plan is the most important part here. And I want to compliment Illinois on something that I do think is a very good component of your plan that does not appear in all of the state's plans across the country. The training plan should probably be signed, well, actually you're required to have it signed by the trainee, by you and the employer. And it's because all three of you are involved in the training plan implementation. In a lot of places around the country, it simply states that the employer and the OJT agency will sign the contract. Well, I don't know about you, but I think it's pretty important that the trainee know what it is that they are to learn. So the training plan actually is a key component of the IEP. And just as with if people are going to classroom training, the IEP must reflect what they will learn and what they're going to be credentialed in, that we need to do that here too. So the training plan is important in terms of giving clarity to the trainee of what they are to learn. And it is also said that we need to, in fact, ensure that it's tied to the IEP. It's important that the employer and supervisor know the training plan because they have to implement it, and the training plan becomes the basis from which we do contract and reimbursement. And then finally, the training plan is going to be important to you because we have to monitor that, in fact, it is being implemented. So the training plan is a key component. And this is basically just to summarize the importance of the training plan. All training plans are unique and customized. It must set out the skills to be learned. It must set out where the training participants' skill levels are to start and where it's intended to be when it's over. There needs to be some system by which we measure attainment, and we need to have it tied to the length of time to learn it and the wage and reimbursement. So probably here's what's important, and these are the next steps, at least as I would put it from this particular discussion. You need to figure out what do you want out of OJT and which of the 4 connection strategies will you emphasize. Setting forth clearly which staff will do which functions and how do we connect, and that should lead to a very good procedures manual. The focus needs to be on the connection activities, both from a compliance perspective and also from a success perspective. And particularly the focus needs to be on putting together the training plan. So that's some quick thoughts in terms of OJT design, in terms of connection and processes, and I'm really looking forward to chatting with you. And any questions or dialogue that you would like to have about what's worked for you or some of the things that you'd like to know more of.
Thank you so much, Greg. And what we're going to do is go ahead and unmute the DCO staff so we can get them started. Mike, can you speak?
Yeah, was that to me, Awana?
That's you.
Okay, hi everyone, this is Mike.
I'm going to go ahead and just introduce yourself very quickly.
Sure, Mike Baker, Illinois DCEO. I'm the lucky guy that has been tasked to try to implement this here with all of you, so I guess I'm the guy.
Thanks so much for making it on. So we're going to go ahead and start the Q&A portion of the webinar, and we have a little bit shy of 30 minutes, so you can go ahead and start asking your questions. What we're going to do is I'll facilitate the questions. You put them in your chat pods, and I will take them in and start them up for discussion with Greg. So the first question from Damar is, do they have to be unemployed since 2008 or for 22 weeks?
Mike, I think you had a comment on that.
Yeah. My understanding from all of the DOL meetings and conversations I've been in is that the dislocation has to have occurred on or after January 1 of 08, but they also have to have been in long-term unemployment for at least 22 weeks. It's not unemployed on January 28th since then. Otherwise, if it was that, then there wouldn't be a need to have the 22 weeks long-term unemployment. They would all be over that. So 22 weeks or longer unemployed, but the dislocation had to have occurred on or after January 1. And the reason for that is that all NEGs are tied to a specific event. So January 1st, 2008 was picked as the event date for this NEG. So any dislocation that occurred on or after that date is eligible to participate in OJT NEG. Does that make sense?
That's my understanding too, Mike, and if I miscommunicated that, I'm sorry. Let me just add a couple of things and see if you think this is right as well. What is important here is that they have been unemployed, not just that they've received unemployment insurance. In other words, someone could have been unemployed for more than 22 weeks and not been a claimant and still be a dislocated worker who is eligible, right?
Right.
And I think that's important because the claimant aspect is one aspect of it, but it's not the only aspect of it. But what you described is my understanding as well, and I'm sorry if I miscommunicated it.
No problem. The other question was, is it possible for them to be eligible for OJT program if they have exhausted their unemployment?
Mike,
Yeah,
do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, those are the 99ers and beyond. Yeah, I mean, if they're still unemployed and haven't worked in over that 22-week period, and they were dislocated after January 1 of 08, yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. As a matter of fact, in many states, that's who the target is those that have been out of the work the longest are those that are most being targeted. So that would not be unusual here.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just wanted to read what Mark mentioned. At this time, the state does not support work keys, and so a lot of you have asked questions on that, and I kind of wanted to just let it fly under the radar, but thanks, for Mark for putting that up there.
I thought I had seen it in the state plan. I'm sorry if I gave bad information. Looks like there's another question here.
Uh-huh. So Kay asks, can an OJT be extended past 6 months if the individual has training challenges?
No, the limit on the training per the DOL guidance is 6 months, so the answer is no.
Mike, in Illinois, is that just for the ARRA or the formula as well that there's a 6-month limit?
That I don't know. I'm the expert on the OJT NEG. In OJT in general, I would need to talk to the policy unit about that. Is Lisa Jones on? Can she hear the conversation? She may know the answer to that.
Lisa's actually listening via broadcast, but I'll go ahead and ask her just to put the answer in on the chat. While she does that, I'll go ahead and move on to the next question. On the OJT policy and procedure guide, it states that the company will be reimbursed for the final 1/3 of the reimbursements once the individual is employed. They receive the final 1/3 regardless, correct?
Which OJT policy and procedure guide is being referenced here?
Jamar, go ahead and just add that into the chat so they know which one you're referring to. Okay, the next question is, just to make sure I understand, can someone be a part of OJT if they may have been laid off in October or November of 2010?
No, they have to be long-term unemployed of at least 22 weeks.
Right, and we've stated that before. The next question is there a minimum or a maximum amount of skills that they're allowed or required on the SATO outline?
I do not know the answer to that question, but we can look at it and find out.
Okay, and then we have a state VR asking, I have no information on ARRA monies being used for OJT. Where can I find this? We'll actually post a lot of this information on the Workforce Professionals pathway once we get everything up and running, but for now you can find it on the DCEO policy page, right?
Yes, and also the National DOL's OJT Toolkit has fantastic information.
Right. as well as templates and all types of resources. And you can go ahead and use those live links that Greg put on his PowerPoint, as well as some of the quick tips that we've added, so that you can use those. That'll take you directly there. Sharon asks, can OJT be utilized for a current employee to secure advancement?
No, that is an incumbent worker situation. Local workforce areas may set aside a percentage of their funding for those types of training opportunities, but this is for unemployed people, long-term unemployed since January 1. So if they are currently employed with an employer, they fit neither of those two criteria. You got to be a dislocated worker.
Right, and then Manny asks, is there a minimum age limit? I'm assuming you're requesting information for use, if this can be used for use.
In all the conversations I've heard, we've targeted people 18 and older.
Right. Richard asks, what may be the pitfalls for the same employer hiring a Put Illinois to Work participant who had previously worked at the facility into an OJT? So continuing subsidized employment.
That's a very big question. We'll have to think about that one. Greg, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Here's what would be my understanding. First of all, there is a requirement that we are not permitted to do an OJT with a company who has someone in layoff in that specific occupation. I would think if this individual had been laid off from a different occupation and was being called back to learn a new occupation, because it couldn't be for the same occupation because they would have the skills. So if they were being called back for a new occupation and that would have a skill gap with their previous ones, I would not know of any legal prohibition.
Guest 6 asks, what happens if the employer does not want to hire the employee after or during the training period? Are they penalized immediately or in the future? I think this is an easy one. This is a test if people will actually listen during the PowerPoint, right?
Well, here's the point for me, and Mike might want to add to this. Here's what we have to make sure we have the right language on. The first issue is that you cannot do OJT with someone who is not hired. The minute the OJT contract is initiated, someone is hired. What I think the question is being asked is, at the end of the training period, to what degree we expect that they are retained. So the issue is not that you train and then you hire. You hire and then you train and then hopefully you retain. We are not permitted to work with employers who do not have, that have a history of not retaining OJT participants. Now, Mike, this is an opinion, and I want to let everybody know this is an opinion, and so I would accept other thoughts from other people on this. But there would be cases where the employer would not retain someone where I think it would be legal. If, in fact, the person, as with any new employee, did not fulfill the terms of the probationary requirements, or, in fact, did not perform well, not due to lack of skills, but through disruptive behaviors or any of the other kinds of things that would typically lead to an employee being let go, I think that that would be permissible. I think it would also be permissible not to retain them if there was a downturn in business conditions. We can't be naive in terms of either of those particular situations. However, what we would not want to have happen is for people to take the training subsidy and then to immediately release people with no due cause. So the real thing to remember here is this is not a train and then decide to hire. It's not tryout employment. People must be hired before they are trained.
Yeah. And I totally reinforce what Greg was saying. The bottom line is there is not an absolute requirement to hire the trainee for all the various reasons that Greg just mentioned. but the intention is that it's not a let's get 6 months of paid employment for someone and plan from the get-go to let them go. I mean, there needs to be a compelling reason why they wouldn't be not hired on, but retained on by the employer. And that's part of the communication process between you folks and the employers that you work with, and also the trainees. I mean, they should go in with the expectation that if they successfully complete the training and if they exhibit the skills at the end of the training to do the job, that they're going to be held on. So, that's the reality.
Christina asks, can an OJT occur concurrently with the last semester of a classroom training to secure employment within their chosen career?
Well, there's certainly no USDOL prohibition. Mike, is there an Illinois policy perspective on that?
I cannot think of anything off the top of my head that would prohibit that. I mean, the conversations I've been part of have been, think outside the box. If there's a way to make it work to get wins out of it that are consistent with the federal guidance and state policy, then it's okay. If we can't find anything in writing that says that this would be a bad idea or be prohibited, then it would be fine.
Well, and I think you would agree with this, Mike. I mean, one thing we must do is we must ensure that those people we have sent to school get attached to the labor market. And I'm very concerned, it may not be true in Illinois, but I'm concerned around the country that we have people who we've paid and invested a great deal of money in terms of going to school, but now are confronting an economy where they can't get a job. And so if OJT provides that gap, and I particularly like the concurrency because I think that when there's a gap between job getting and training completion, it leads to the likelihood of non-training related employment. So I think from a program design perspective, it's really good.
Just remember though, as long as that individual meets the eligibility requirements of the program.
Absolutely.
I wanted to cut in for 1 second. I'm going to go ahead and ask Mark to join us. Can you hear us, Mike? Mark?
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. So Mark is also on. He was very busy on the chats, and I thought it'd be a good idea for him to join us on the call as well. So just go ahead and introduce yourself quickly.
This is Mark Burgess. I work with the policy unit here at DCO, along with Lisa Jones, but she's unavailable to speak at this time.
Very good. Thanks so much. So we can continue on. The next question is, if experience is job requirement, can an OJT be used to gain experience, such as with CNAs?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that, Joanna.
I'm thinking that they're saying, can OJT be used to gain job experience, such as with CNAs?
Well, my understanding is that someone needs to have a CNA certification before they can actually work as a CNA. So I don't think that's a good example because you've got to be hired on by the employer and do your training while you're hired. So in effect, that would result in somebody being on the job, being trained as a CNA that obviously doesn't have a certificate yet. So I think you're probably going to find that most, like long-term care facilities and hospitals, that would be a major insurance liability risk for them. I don't really see that as a viable option in that particular example.
Right. And then the second question here from Sarah is, what about a worker who received their warn letter from a company who would be eligible for regular dislocated worker program but not officially laid off yet?
Okay, let's go back to how long does someone have to be unemployed to be eligible?
Oh, that's right.
22 weeks.
Okay. Do we have any other questions here? I see them rolling in.
It looks like Michael is following up on the CNA question, if they have.
Hey, just a second there, Mike. With that last question from Sarah, I guess you got to be able to distinguish if it's through the NEG or just a normal OJT, because The difference is in how long they have to be unemployed for the normal OJT.
True. Good point, Mark. Yep, everybody, please keep in mind, my responses are specific to the NEG. So there may be exceptions or other latitude granted for OJT that's being funded by regular WIA dollars.
We have a question from Kay, and her question is, if an individual tests lowly on the Prove It or Work keys, are they able to retest in order to qualify for the OJT grant, or is this to be considered a one-time testing?
Kay, just so I'm clear, because I didn't want to lead to confusion on this, if they in fact meet all of the requirements of the job, they would not be OJT eligible at all. So in fact, individuals who did not test well would be the OJT candidates. This is not an entry to a qualification. This is an assessment of skills to identify the skill gap. And literally, OJT is for people who do not meet the qualifications. So no matter what assessment tool you use, what really is important here is that you're looking for people that are not fully qualified. And the employer must provide training to bring them up to speed, and that training must be beyond the training that would be offered to any new employee, because it must be extraordinary costs that they incur in the provision of that training. So just so you know, this isn't an eligibility requirement for OJT. It is an assessment tool to assess how big the skill gap is, and the skill gap must exist.
Right. But to reinforce that, keep in mind that you've got a small training window here for the NEG, 6 months maximum. So you've got to make sure that the gap is not too great so that when the individual enters training, that they have a reasonable chance of successfully completing the training and knowing how to do that job at the end of the training. So that's very much an individual case-by-case assessment that you've got to look at so that you don't put somebody in that really doesn't have much of a realistic opportunity to be hired or retained on after the training is over.
Anna, I'm noticing a question here from Daniel. Someone who is WIA eligible would not be eligible for OJT if they have been unemployed for 22 weeks. But Mike, again, we want to make that distinction between the formula OJT and this special OJT program that is the NEG OJT, right?
Correct. The 22 weeks applies only to the OJT NEG. And someone asked earlier, what is NEG? That's National Emergency Grant.
There's another question here. If a person has earned their certified nursing assistant certificate but can't get employed because employers want people with certificate and experience, could OJT be used to secure the experience?
Mike, do you want me to give you my shot on that?
Well, I can guess what your shot is, but go ahead. I'll see if I can.
Well, no, I'll start with you, and then I'll follow up.
Well, I'm thinking that, if they have a certificate, they ought to be qualified for the job. So, the OJT is to increase the skill sets of individuals that are not qualified for the job. But Greg, what's your take?
Well, I think that's right. The only caveat I would add is that the question is a good one, actually, because what the person is saying, and I think this is what I call a tough economy, where many employers are demanding not just credentialing, but demanding work experience in that field. And so what I'm understanding the question to be here is, can we just use OJT as a basis of getting that experience? And I think the answer would be no. However, here's what I think is also true. I can't answer that question because I don't know what the job is that I could conceivably be a CNA And there could be a job that is CNA. But if I have some specific skills that I need as a CNA that I have not learned that are peculiar or specific to that job, then there could be a skill gap even though I have been credentialed. And so this, even in this particular case, but in all cases, it's very difficult to answer a question like that because you can't make that determination without comparing the individual against a specific job. Does that make sense, Mike?
It does. Like, for example, that your response makes me think of an example where it might be okay. There are certain, there are different kinds of CNAs. I mean, long-term care, in a hospital, in a doctor's office, or even home health. There are slightly different skill sets that go with each of those operating venues, if you will. So there may be, you know, additional training that would go on top of the CNA. I think, and that's the key. If there's a training element that gives them additional skill sets on top of their CNA certificate, then I think you've got an argument that it's appropriate. But if it's just, we're not going to give you any additional training, it's just bring you on board so you can work a little bit to get, say you have experience on your resume, I don't think that's a good fit.
Well, I agree, because OJT is not a work experience program, it's a training program.
Right. I wanted to ask one of the questions that we passed up. Guest number 5 asks, is it possible to work with a staffing service with an OJT if they have expressed interest?
This is Mark again, and the problem with that would be that there's an expectation of hiring afterwards, and I don't know how a staffing service would comply with that portion of the requirements.
And also, just noting from the various workforce trends, a lot of employers are utilizing temp help for the sake that they're temp, and so a lot of that is going on as well. So I think that would be another downfall to using that.
The exception I can think of is if the staffing service also has as part of its mission job placement. If they're willing to, funnel folks to the program and then turn them loose to allow the employer to hire them, then that's okay. I mean, that's another source of employees, especially if you're in an area where you don't have a giant pool of dislocated workers already in your system to pull from. If you're kind of scrambling for people, that might be a viable option. But the key is, in my mind, the temp service has to turn loose of that person and the company has to hire them.
We have a question here from Rosie that asks, Greg, have you ever seen a situation where an employer requests their new employee to take a few additional classes while participating in the OJT, and can that be written into the plan and paid? This wouldn't be ITA. Greg, are you there? Oh, I think that Greg got cut off, so we're going to hold that off. Greg, are you back on? Let me go ahead and unmute him. Sorry about that, folks.
Rosie, do you have a particular example in mind, or is this hypothetical?
And I found Greg. 1 second.
Yeah,
Are you back?
I'm not sure what happened. I'm sorry.
It must have been a really good question, huh? It scared you off.
No, it went dead. It was like I was cut off. But anyway, maybe I said something bad. I don't know. But anyway, where are we? I'm very sorry.
No problem. So Rosie asked the question. I'm going to go ahead and... Greg, have you ever seen a situation where an employer requests their new employee to take a few additional classes while participating in OJT, and can that be written into the plan and paid? This wouldn't be an ITA.
Well, yes, I have seen that, And actually, in North Carolina, that's a key component of their strategy. And I think I read, Mike, in your state plan, that's something you're permitting under NEG, ARRA, OJT as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, so that would be fine. I'll tell you what would be a good example of that is there may be a gap in terms of software knowledge. And that may be something the employer is not prepared to teach, but it's something that could be purchased in the shorter term, concurrent with the with the OJT that is happening at the work site. So that's a good thing.
We have another question here from Chris, and the question is, if a person has experience such as a home health aide, which does not require certification, would it be allowable for an employer, such as a nursing home, to offer the CNA training under OJT?
Mike?
I think that would be fine under the NEG. I mean, in order to work as a CNA, they have to get the certificate. However, having said that, it goes back to our earlier point that I think most healthcare facilities probably are not going to want to have somebody on the floor that's not already certified.
Like we have some other people typing in here.
Yeah. Just so you all know, we have another 5 minutes or so go ahead and try to get your questions in. We're going to try to end on time. I don't know what happened. Everybody just got kicked off at that moment, huh?
It looks like there's 2 people typing right now.
Someone asks, I've never accessed NEG. Is this a lengthy process?
The NEG grants are going to our local workforce areas, so those are the grantees, and they are our local operators, if you will. So to access the NEG funding, you would have to work with the staff of your local workforce investment area.
Sharon asks, is there a maximum amount of OJT contract is written for, total amount over the 6-month period?
I don't believe there's a hard dollar limit, but you are limited to the amount of funding, the hourly rate of pay to $22.17 an hour in Illinois. So as long as you stay under that and the cost of the training is reasonable and appropriate, depending on the number of people you have, you just have to kind of stay with that wage rate or below.
And also, Mike, wouldn't you agree that the maximum amount of the contract can be no larger than the amount of time that is needed to learn the skill? In other words, the amount of the contract varies based in the NEG OJT on business size in terms of the reimbursement level. So that's one factor. The other factor is what is the duration of the training, and that must be rooted in the skill gap analysis. So the amount is not specified as a maximum, but there must be a rational basis from which the amount is determined, and that's based upon the reimbursement, the number of hours, and the skill gap that dictates the number of hours.
Right. It's very much going to vary on a case-by-case basis depending on the skill gap and the training.
We have another question here from Christine. If a person is unsuccessful in their OJT, can they be placed in another OJT within the 6-month time frame?
That is an interesting question that I would need to check with a few folks on, because if a person let me look at it this way. When the employer hires the trainee on, they're on the payroll, okay? So that essentially takes them out of the 22-week time frame, okay? So I would need to get some more opinions on that. My initial answer is probably not, but there may be extenuating circumstances. So let me do some checking, and we'll get a firm answer to that.
I've never been asked that question before.
Yeah, I think for regular OJT, it's probably not a problem. I'll defer to Mark and Lisa's opinion on that. But for the NEG with that 22-week long-term unemployment criterion for eligibility, that might kick them out of that.
We've been trying to go to the contact side of the PowerPoint, and it's not happening for some reason. So I've moved over to Greg's information if you need it. We have about 4 more minutes or so on this Q&A, so go ahead and add your information in. You also have my information from the reminder email if you need to get a hold of me. And I'll go ahead and ask a couple more questions. We have Joe, who hasn't asked a question before. If our office wanted to help a business set up OJT, who is the contact to make OJT happen, LWIA 9? Well, actually, we have some links on the business pathway where you can find your local workforce area, and I would just connect with the Chicago Workforce Investment Board. They would be able to help you assist depending on who their providers are. We also have Dan Fitzpatrick on, who does LWIA 9 and 7, and he's one of their providers, and he's been experienced with OJT. And I don't know, Dan, if you want to go ahead and just say hello so Joe can connect with you. If not, Joe, I can go ahead and send you that information offline. You also have Richard. Very good. Thanks so much, Richard. Sharon also asks, do we also pay for the customer FICA, et cetera, or just pay the rate of hours worked? What about health insurance if the company offers at day 1 and or at 90 days?
Well, it's my understanding that it's the wages and benefits that go with it of being employed. Let me double check that. Actually, I don't recall hearing that question before in any of the meetings I've been at, but my understanding has been that they're being hired on like a regular employee, so they get everything that goes with that.
That's correct, Mike. That was our understanding. Yeah. We had talked to that when we were developing policy and that with fiscal, and they did indicate that's kind of a package deal.
Fantastic.
They're expected to be provided it, and we would include that in the reimbursement cost.
Well, we reimburse 50%.
Well, yeah, whatever the reimbursement rate is.
Oh, and Rose, I'm actually amazed it took this long for this question to come up for Rosie on when the NEG grants will be awarded. We're pushing them through the approval process now. We have a couple of system glitches that have reared their head today that we're working through, but I hope to be able to put my initial approval on those by close of business today or Monday at the latest. So very shortly.
Can I just bring one thing up here real quickly as we're wrapping up? One thing that I wish that I had done at the beginning of the webinar, because I wasn't aware of the wide variety of people who are on the webinar, is that there are many different kinds of on-the-job training. Actually, on-the-job training is permitted through TANF and through welfare to work programs. OJT is permitted through trade. OJT is permitted in the WIA formula money, and then there's this special new program of the NEG OJT. OJT is similar in some cases across all of those programs, but you do have to, in fact, look at specific policy for each program in relationship to its OJT. So, for instance, the department has policy 04-02 that is what governs the WIA OJT. Trade Act has regulations governing OJT. So I'm sorry that if we didn't direct traffic well on this, but some of these technical questions are all based upon the specifics of that specific OJT program. And I just think that it's probably worth highlighting that.
Okay, so we're about a minute off. So with that, I'd like to just take a minute to thank everyone that made it on the webinar. We invite you to come back if you've registered for the webinar on Monday. It's not the same exact one. We usually do various sessions of the same webinar, but this is actually building upon what you've learned today. Thank you so much for the DCO staff that was able to make it and the workNet staff. We had a whole team of people kind of making this happen today, and more importantly, thank you so much, Greg. I know you have such a hectic schedule, and you're off on a flight now, and such a jet setter all over the country, but we really appreciate your time and effort in putting this together and sharing your knowledge with Illinois.
No, thank you, and thanks to everybody. I hope everybody has a good weekend and we get to see you on Monday. Can we just see a quick show of hands? How many of you got at least something out of this? Can we see a show of hands?
Go ahead and use your little guy.
Oh, that's looking pretty good. We love talking with you, so thanks a lot. Good weekend, and we'll see you on Monday.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.